The bomber came in so low that the spray from the gray Black Sea flecked its underside. The twin engines of the Douglas A-20 howled at full power as the pilot eased the throttles forward, the nose hammering toward a dark line of ships on the horizon. In the glassed-in nose, the navigator lay on his stomach over a bomb sight and a chart board, shouting course corrections over the intercom. Behind them, the dorsal gunner craned his neck, watching the tracer fire reaching up from German and Romanian escorts, while the ventral gunner crouched over his weapon, trying to pick out threats against a background of whitecaps and smoke. Ahead, the target grew larger, a heavily laden transport packed with troops. Lifeboats already swung out in nervous anticipation. The A-20 flashed past the masts of an escort, so low that the guns on the deck had to depress almost flat to try to track it. The navigator called out the seconds to release. The pilot steadied the aircraft at mast-height, and with a sharp clunk, the bomb fell away, skipping once, twice across the water in front of the ship, before slamming into the hull just above the waterline. By the time the explosion sent a column of water and steel skyward, the A-20 was already gone, disappearing into the haze, its gun turrets chattering at any flak position that dared to follow. Behind it, more aircraft followed the same attack path, a deadly procession at wave-top height. This kind of attack did not exist in Soviet doctrine when the war began. It was born out of crisis, improvisation, and a foreign aircraft that the Soviet Union had not asked for, but desperately needed. On June 22, 1941, Operation Barbarossa fell on the Soviet Union with a violence that destroyed entire command structures in days and left the Red Army Air Forces reeling. Luftwaffe units operating from newly captured forward fields hammered Soviet bases and formations on the ground and in the air. By the end of that first terrible year, the Soviets had lost 9,173 aircraft. It was a number beyond immediate replacement, even for an industrial giant. Factories were being dismantled and reassembled east of the Urals, designs revised, production lines restarted under bombardment. But time was something Moscow did not have. So the Soviets turned outward, to the same capitalist powers they had once condemned. Under Lend-Lease, British and American aircraft began arriving in Arctic convoys and through Iran. Hurricanes, P-40s, P-39s, Boston bombers. Moscow had dreamed of receiving the great American four-engine heavy bombers, the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress and the consolidated B-24 Liberator, but those never came. What did arrive in numbers and on time was something very different, a compact, fast, twin-engine attack bomber called the Douglas A-20. The Soviets knew it by another name, inherited from the RAF, the Boston. The machine that would become a scourge of Axis shipping in Soviet hands began life years earlier as a Douglas project designated the 7A. Lead engineer Ed Heinemann and project manager John K. Jack Northrop, names that would echo through aviation history, shaped the basic concept. A twin-engine, shoulder-wing bomber able to carry a useful bomb load at high speed, with enough defensive armament for self-protection. The Douglas 7A carried a crew of 3 and about 1,764 pounds of bombs. 3 30-caliber machine guns were mounted in the nose, dorsal and ventral positions. It was a promising aircraft for its time, but the U.S. Army Air Corps wanted more. In response to a competition for a new attack bomber, Douglas scaled up the design into the 7B. This bigger aircraft sported a greater wingspan, more powerful engines, and tricycle landing gear that improved handling on the ground and when landing. The performance figures were impressive, a maximum speed around 325 miles per hour and the ability to carry roughly 2,400 pounds of bombs. Armament was increased to 4 fixed forward-firing 30-caliber guns and 3 more inflexible mounts for dorsal and ventral gunners. From this basis, the Douglas A-20 series emerged. The RAF ordered the type as the Boston. When the Soviet Union found itself fighting for survival and asked London and Washington for help, the British diverted 277 Bostons from their own orders and sent them straight to Murmansk. From there, in Arctic cold and perpetual twilight, Soviet crews ferried the airplanes south to be absorbed into the Red Air Force and the Soviet Naval Air Arm. For the VVS, the standard Soviet Air Force, the A-20 Boston was a flexible tool. It served as a tactical day bomber, a night bomber, a reconnaissance platform, and even as a night fighter and intruder aircraft. In Soviet naval aviation, the VVS-VMF, the aircraft was given roles that no other nation had widely explored. As a torpedo bomber, a mine layer, and a low-level anti-shipping strike aircraft, in addition to high-level bombing and reconnaissance. Across the entire Soviet Union, 2,171 A-20s of all variants arrived under Lend-Lease. Of those, Soviet naval aviation received 663, the bulk of them the A-20G model. That version carried a formidable forward battery of 650 caliber machine guns in a solid nose, plus a powered dorsal turret with twin 50s and a single 50 caliber gun in the ventral tunnel position. In American service, the A-20G had been built as a hard-hitting attack bomber, optimized for strafing. The Soviets saw something different in that solid nose, dead weight in the most valuable volume of the airplane, so they changed it. In Soviet naval service, navigation over featureless sea in poor weather and long Arctic nights was critical. So important, in fact, that the Soviets considered having a dedicated navigator inside each bomber to be non-negotiable. When they received A-20G aircraft with that solid gun nose, they often stripped it out and replaced it with a glazed nose section, restoring a navigator's position and bomb sight. They typically kept only the two lower nose guns, sacrificing some frontal firepower for better navigation and attack precision. Soviet ground crews and engineers went further. They fitted A-20s with special external racks compatible with their own FAB bomb series, 100 kilogram, 200 kilogram, 50 kilogram, and even 1,000 kilogram weapons could now hang under the wings. The A-20's structure tolerated these loads well enough, though performance suffered when loaded heavy. External torpedo racks were added, allowing the aircraft to carry Soviet airborne torpedoes. In theory, two could hang under the wings. In practice, with fuel demands and harsh operating conditions, Soviet crews almost always carried just one. Range and survivability mattered more than volume of torpedoes. The A-20 proved equally adaptable to mine warfare. Naval engineers designed fittings for air-delivered sea mines, such as the AMG-1 and the AMD family in 500 and 1,000 kilogram variants. Loaded with these, A-20s could thread their way at night toward harbor approaches, fjord mouths and narrow channels, laying minefields designed on map and chart by staff officers who understood where Axis shipping had no choice but to pass. Soviet A-20s usually flew with 3 or 4 crew members: pilot, navigator bombardier in the nose, dorsal gunner, and often a ventral gunner. The navigator was treated as essential. On long missions over water, especially in the Arctic and Baltic where weather and darkness reduced visibility to almost nothing, it was the navigator who kept the aircraft on course with dead reckoning, radio beacons, and experience. In Soviet naval aviation, A-20 units were organized along standard lines. A squadron comprised 9 aircraft. 3 squadrons plus a 3-aircraft headquarters flight formed a regiment, a polk, of about 30 aircraft on paper. These A-20 regiments were designated as Mine Torpedo Aviation Polk, MTAP. It was an honest name. Their weapons were mines and torpedoes. Their targets were ships. Their battlefield was the sea. It was not enough simply to have the aircraft. The Soviets had to develop a way of using them that made sense in their conditions, against the Axis fleets and convoys operating in the Black Sea, the Arctic, the Baltic, and the Pacific. Over time, a standard pattern emerged. First, maritime reconnaissance, often with Bostons themselves or with P-2s, located enemy convoys or individual ships. Once a worthwhile target was detected and plotted, a strike would be assembled at a coastal airfield. Typically, an assault regiment of Ilyushin IL-2 Sturmovik aircraft, armored ground attack machines, was tasked to go in first. Their role was brutally simple: fly at low level, straight at the escorting warships, and rake their decks with cannon and machine gun fire, suppressing or distracting anti-aircraft crews. If available, dive bombers such as the Petlyakov P-2 followed, aiming to damage escorts and transports with well-placed bombs from medium altitude. Only then, when defenses were softened and the convoy thrown into confusion, did the A-20s come in, either dropping torpedoes from low altitude or performing high-speed, low-level Mast-Height bombing runs. Fighter regiments, equipped with everything from American Bell P-39 Airacobras and Curtiss P-40 Warhawks to British Hurricanes and Soviet-built Yakovlev fighters, provided escort, weaving above and around the attacking formations to fend off Luftwaffe and Axis fighters. One particular technique would become central to A-20 operations, a method the Americans had developed in the South Pacific and the Soviets quickly adapted to their own seas. In U.S. parlance, it was skip bombing. In Soviet terminology, it became Mast-Height bombing. The idea was to fly directly at a ship at very low altitude, releasing a bomb at just the right moment so that it would hit the water, skip like a stone, and slam into the hull near or just above the waterline before detonating. Done correctly, this was lethal and accurate. Done poorly, it risked the attacking aircraft slamming into masts, rigging, or a wall of fire. The Soviets expanded the concept further, often dropping bombs with short time delay fuses at the base of dams, piers and structures to let them sink before exploding, using water itself as a transmission medium for shock. The A-20, fast, stable at low altitude, and with room for a skilled navigator in the nose, was an ideal platform for such precision work. From the Arctic to the Black Sea, every Red Banner Fleet, the Black Sea Fleet, Northern Fleet, Baltic Fleet, and Pacific Fleet received MTAP regiments equipped with A-20s. Their stories were as varied as the waters they flew over. But everywhere they served, the same American-built, Soviet-modified aircraft became a persistent, low-level threat to Axis shipping. In the south, along the Black Sea, the war at sea had taken a grim turn by 1943. In the early phases of the conflict, Soviet submarines and torpedo boats had tried to contest Axis shipping in those waters. Their successes were real but uneven. German and Romanian forces, with Luftwaffe cover and well-sighted coastal batteries, steadily pushed Soviet ground troops and the Black Sea Fleet eastward, toward the Caucasus. Major Soviet surface units found themselves effectively bottled up in a handful of ports.
The struggle against Axis convoys carrying troops and supplies to Crimea and the southern front shifted to those vessels that could still reach the enemy.
Submarines in the depths and aircraft in the air. Into this constrained, dangerous theater came the A-20 units of Black Sea Fleet Aviation. Beginning in the spring of 1943, A-20s gradually replaced older IL-4 long-range bombers in several mine torpedo regiments. By then, the Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe had forced the Red Army back to the edge of the sea, and the Black Sea Fleet was fighting a holding action from ports tucked into the Caucasus coastline. The main offensive weight of the fleet against Axis naval forces now rested with submarines, small torpedo craft, and the steadily growing power of naval aviation. As more IL-2s, P-2s and A-20s arrived, the tempo of air attacks increased. VVS VMF CHF units, including A-20 equipped regiments such as 36th MTAP, 13th GMTAP, and 5th GMTAP, began hitting Axis shipping and naval bases with growing confidence. Raids on Kerch, Feodosia, Ivan Baba, Sevastopol, and other Crimean ports became regular events. These attacks were not mere harassment. They sank or damaged enough ships and threatened enough convoys that German and Romanian naval commanders increasingly shifted operations to night or insisted on strong fighter escort by day. The Soviets adapted in turn. A-20 MTAP units took up nocturnal work, laying minefields by night outside ports and in coastal channels. Individual aircraft, each carrying one or two mines, would set off in darkness using dead reckoning or homing on radio beacons. Navigators counted minutes and degrees on their charts, then called for release at the calculated moment, scattering AMG and AMD mines into channels that ships would later discover in the worst possible way. As the Red Army slowly recovered from earlier defeats and began to push west, more and more Axis troops were squeezed into the Crimean Peninsula. By early 1944, over 170,000 German and Romanian soldiers were trapped there. Soviet ground advances brought Black Sea Fleet bases closer to the peninsula, shortening the flight time to Crimean ports. With Luftwaffe fighter strength in decline, many units having been pulled back to defend German cities against Allied heavy bomber raids, the Axis convoys were increasingly exposed to naval air power. In April 1944, German and Romanian naval units, including Romanian Navy ships supported by Kriegsmarine S-boat and R-boat flotillas, began a large-scale effort to evacuate troops from Crimean pockets. Soviet submarines and torpedo boats renewed their attacks, but Black Sea Fleet aviation had grown too powerful to be ignored. VVS-VMF units intensified both day and night strikes, with A-20s often flying in the most dangerous roles, low-level attacks on convoys under heavy fire. One of the most dramatic clashes came on April 18, 1944. The Romanian motor vessel Alba Iulia left Crimea loaded with troops and Soviet prisoners of war, escorted by the destroyer NMS Mast-Height, the gunboat Ghiculescu, a submarine chaser, and an R-boat. At 12:20, a Soviet submarine attack was detected and driven off. Minutes ticked by. Then the sky darkened. First came 4 IL-4 bombers from 5th GM-TAP. They attacked from about 1,000 meters, dropping bombs that splashed wide, close but not decisive. At 12:37, the character of the battle changed. 4 A-20G Bostons of 36th MTAP dived on the convoy out of the sun. Fast, compact, presenting fleeting targets, they dropped their bombs near the Alba Iulia. One blast tore a large hole in the hull. Another penetrated a storage area and detonated amid crowded compartments, killing around 500 Soviet prisoners of war crammed into the ship. It was a bitter irony. Lend-Lease aircraft from America, flown by Soviet crews, killing Soviet captives held by the Axis. Despite the damage and casualties, Alba Iulia refused to sink. At 13:20, 3 more A-20s attacked, dropping bombs that killed soldiers already in the water. Finally, 5 torpedo-carrying A-20s came in for what should have been the finishing blow, but under heavy escort fire and in confused conditions, all their torpedoes missed. 2 of the attacking A-20s were shot down. The convoy fought its way clear. Eventually, the wounded Alba Iulia was towed into Constanta, where she remained for the rest of the war, never sailing again. Bad weather then descended on the Black Sea, curtailing air operations for several days. But when the skies cleared, the A-20s returned. On April 22nd, a dozen A-20Gs from the 13th GD-BAP, now a Guards regiment, under podpolkovnik Mikhail Kurochkin, attacked another convoy. Their primary target was the tanker Osag. Bombs struck home, badly damaging her. She would later sink from the cumulative effects. German fighters responded, and 2 of the A-20s were shot down. The Boston gunners gave as good as they got. They claimed 2 Messerschmitt Bf-109s of 6JG-52 shot down and 1 more A-20 crash-landed from engine failure. The duel between tankers and torpedo bombers, fighters and gunners, played out up and down the coast as the Axis struggled to extract men and supplies, and the Soviets tried to deny them that lifeline. As German and Romanian forces fell back into Romania proper, A-20 MTAP units continued to mine and bomb. Mines dropped from A-20s in June 1944 paid off. On June 18th, the subchaser UJ-316 struck one of these mines off Sulina and sank. On June 23rd, 2 more subchasers, UJ-307 and UJ-2306, went down off Varna after hitting mines seeded from the air. Each success was a delayed echo of a nighttime sortie months earlier. When an A-20 crew had flown in darkness over cold water, released a single mine at a navigator's call, and turned for home without seeing the result. By late summer, the Soviet High Command was ready to remove Romania from the war entirely. On August 20, 1944, the Red Army launched a major offensive. That same day, Black Sea Fleet Aviation struck at the heart of Axis naval power in the region, the port of Constanta. It was a massive raid. 62 P-2 dive bombers and 14 A-20G bombers from the 40th BAP and 13th GD-BAP took part, escorted and supported by some 80 IL-2s and Yak-9 fighters. The attack went in waves. Smoke bombs were dropped to blind anti-aircraft gunners, masking the bombers as they rolled in. Over the harbor, a maze of overlapping flak patterns rose, crisscrossed by tracer fire, but the Soviet formations pushed through. When the smoke cleared, the tally was devastating. 3 German U-boats lay sunk, 8 S-boats, 1 R-boat, 3 Romanian midget submarines, a motor torpedo boat, and a tanker were sent to the bottom. 2 destroyers and many smaller ships were sunk or badly damaged. In a single day, the threat of Axis naval forces in the Black Sea was effectively neutralized. 4 days later, on August 23rd, Romania declared a ceasefire and armistice. 2 weeks later, it signed unconditional surrender. Much of this result had been shaped, behind the scenes and in the attacks themselves, by A-20 regiments that had learned to use an American aircraft in a uniquely Soviet way, armed with Soviet bombs and torpedoes, directed by Soviet navigators, striking along Soviet shorelines. Far to the north, where the sea freezes and winter turns days into twilight, the A-20 found another hunting ground. In the Arctic, the Soviet Northern Fleet had a double task: support the land front in northern Russia and Finland, and harass German coastal shipping along the Norwegian and Finnish coasts. The same waters carried the vital Allied Arctic convoys to Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. They were also lifelines for German troops, fuel and ore. In the spring of 1943, Northern Fleet Aviation began to receive A-20s. The 9th MTAP took them on as torpedo bombers. The 118th ORAP Reconnaissance Regiment added the type for maritime patrol and photo reconnaissance. Later, in the summer of 1944, the veteran 36th MTAP, blooded in the Black Sea, redeployed north to join them. A-20 strength in the Arctic continued to grow through 1944. Their missions reflected the particular demands of the theater. Northern Fleet A-20s were tasked not only with attacking ships and naval bases along the ragged coasts of northern Norway and Finland, but also with supporting Soviet naval infantry and amphibious operations, inserting naval scouts by parachute behind German lines, and resupplying those teams with airdrops. Admiral Arseny Golovko, commander of the Northern Fleet, understood that he had to coordinate all his tools, submarines, torpedo cutters, aircraft, if he wanted to make a dent in German coastal traffic. In early 1944, he launched a series of coordinated anti-shipping campaigns designated RV-1, RV-2, and RV-3, running from January through April. Results for the A-20s in these early efforts were modest: 2 ships sunk and 2 damaged by A-20 strikes. Submarines and torpedo craft sank several more. Part of the problem was the harsh weather. Part was the sheer difficulty of finding and attacking small, well-defended convoys, moving under cover of fjords and bad visibility. Golovko and his staff adjusted and tried again. From May 11 to 29, 1944, they mounted Operation RV-4, a more aggressive combination of submarine patrols, torpedo boat sweeps, and naval aviation attacks. When a Soviet PE-2 reconnaissance aircraft finally located a German convoy on May 11th, they threw everything they had at it. The first wave was 6 IL-4 torpedo bombers with 5 fighters in escort. They attacked under heavy fire and scored no hits. The second wave followed: 5 A-20 torpedo bombers and 10 fighters. This time, the result was tangible. A torpedo from one of the Bostons found and sank the escort vessel V6113. Over the next 2 days, from May 13 to 14, Soviet aircrews flew 10 attacks and 217 sorties against the convoy. A-20s and other aircraft sank and damaged multiple ships. The planets of reconnaissance, timing, and execution had aligned, and the A-20s had helped turn a shadowy, frustrating campaign into visible success. Larger operations were coming. In late 1944, the Soviet High Command prepared for a major offensive in the far north, the Petsamo-Kirkenes operation. Its aim was to drive the German 19th Mountain Corps out of northern Russia and parts of Finland and Norway, seizing key bases and severing German grip on the Arctic littoral. The 14th Army, the 7th Air Army, and Northern Fleet warships, naval aviation, and naval infantry units would all take part. The offensive began on October 7, 1944. As ground forces advanced over frozen tundra and rocky ridges, the Northern Fleet unleashed everything it had at German shipping and ports. A dozen submarine attacks probed German escort lines. 3 major torpedo boat operations slashed at convoys in fjords. Above them, waves of aircraft, PE-2s, IL-2s, MiGs, Yaks, and A-20s hit ships in harbor and at sea. Within this storm, the A-20s made their mark. Northern Fleet Bostons were credited with sinking the repair ship Sudmir with aerial torpedoes, knocking out a valuable floating workshop. They torpedoed and sank the minesweeper R-301 and the patrol vessel V6111, and destroyed additional smaller vessels in Kirkenes Harbor and elsewhere. Other A-20 crews flew low to bomb coastal batteries and provide direct air support to naval infantry forces storming beaches and rocky shores. Some flew special missions, dropping supplies by parachute to Northern Fleet naval commandos operating behind German lines. The cumulative effect was decisive. Shipping losses made it harder for the Germans to move men and supplies along the coast. Air and sea attacks on ports disrupted logistics and damaged the morale of troops already strained by a retreat in inhospitable terrain. By October 26, 1944, major combat operations for the Northern Fleet were over. German forces withdrew, leaving behind more than 90,000 tons of supplies in their haste. In the Arctic, the A-20 had done its work in a campaign few outside specialists ever heard about. Closer to the Soviet heartland, in the constrained waters of the Baltic, A-20s faced a different problem. There, the Red Banner Baltic Fleet, VMF-KBF, had spent much of the war pinned in the Gulf of Finland. German control of the coasts, dominance of the skies, and extensive minefields laid across the narrow waters had bottled Soviet submarines and surface ships around Kronstadt and Leningrad. The fleet's main heavy units were effectively trapped, used primarily as floating batteries and symbols of defiance. By early 1944, however, the front around Leningrad had shifted. Soviet ground offensives were finally relieving the city and pushing Finnish and German forces away from the southern shores of Lake Ladoga and the Gulf of Finland. The Baltic Fleet, long contained, now looked for ways to strike back. Submarines, torpedo boats, and above all naval aviation offered the chance to reach beyond the mine barriers. In that context, Baltic Fleet Aviation began incorporating A-20s into its MTAP regiments. The first GMTAP, which had been equipped with IL-4s, started converting to A-20s. A new 51st MTAP was formed. The 15th ORAP Reconnaissance Regiment also added A-20s to its strength. These units took on the task of attacking Axis mine layers and escort ships maintaining the very belts that had confined the Baltic Fleet for so long. Single A-20Gs, armed with a single torpedo, prowled the Gulf of Finland, flying dangerous solo missions. On May 26, 1944, one of these aircraft from the 1st GMTAP found and torpedoed the German ship Ingeborg, sending her to the bottom. It was a small but symbolic strike against the network that had hemmed in Soviet naval forces. Soon, Soviet air raids began to hit ports along the Finnish Gulf, further pressuring Axis naval operations. By June 20, 1944, the Red Army's Karelian Front launched its own offensive against Finland. Along that front, a specific target loomed large in Soviet planning: the hydroelectric dam at Sphere 3 on the Sphere River. The dam did more than generate power. It controlled water levels crucial to potential amphibious operations. Soviet commanders feared that Finnish forces would open floodgates just as Soviet troops attempted river crossings, turning assault beaches into disaster zones. So a specialized mission was assigned to the A-20 units of Baltic Fleet Aviation. The 51st MTAP and 1st GMTAP would try to destroy the Sphere 3 dam itself. For 2 days, A-20s from the 51st MTAP and 5 IL-4s from the 1st GMTAP flew repeated sorties against the target. In total, they carried out 24 sorties. 4 of the A-20s had been fitted with external racks capable of carrying 2 1,000-kilogram bombs, or a 1,000-kilogram and a 500-kilogram bomb in combination. The remaining aircraft carried 4 250-kilogram bombs each. All bombs were fitted with 22-second time delay fuses, designed to allow them to sink beneath the water surface along the dam before detonating. The tactic mirrored, on a static structure, the logic of Mast-Height bombing against ships. Use proximity to amplify destructive effect. Attack formations of 12 or 13 aircraft, with fighter escort, came in low and fast, dropping their bombs near the rear face of the dam. On June 20th, 24 bombs fell, including 4 of the 1,000-kilogram monsters. 16 struck the dam itself. The following day, June 21st, a large hole was blasted in the structure. The Sphere 3 dam was effectively destroyed. That same day, the Soviet Army began amphibious landings as part of the Svir-Petrozavodsk offensive. The feared flood never came. The cost for the air crews was 1 IL-4 shot down. Once that task was completed, the A-20 regiments returned to their primary prey, ships. In the Baltic, that meant German minesweepers, landing barges, and Finnish gunboats. In the relentless attacks that followed, many of these small but vital vessels were damaged or sunk. On June 23rd, the German destroyer Z-29 was heavily damaged by A-20 attacks and was out of action for 8 months, a major loss at a time when Germany's surface fleet was shrinking. In high summer 1944, another target appeared on Soviet aerial photographs, a ship named Niobe, in the Finnish port of Kotka. She was no ordinary vessel. The Niobe was the former Dutch armored cruiser Gelderland, rebuilt by the Kriegsmarine as a flagship. Her decks bristled with anti-aircraft guns, 4 105mm, 4 40mm, and 4 quadruple 20mm mounts. She also carried Würzburg radar. Her job was simple: make Kotka harbor a dangerous place for Soviet aircraft. The port itself was ringed with additional anti-aircraft guns. Any strike would have to run a gauntlet of fire. The Soviets decided to do it anyway. They planned a layered attack, each wave designed to peel away some of Niobe's defenses. First came the IL-2 Sturmovix, attacking the shore-based anti-aircraft artillery around the harbor. Their cannons and rockets battered gun positions, forcing some to cease fire or at least duck for cover. Next, PE-2 dive bombers rolled in, also in waves. In 3 separate attacks, they scored 4 direct hits on Niobe and 6 near misses, damaging her but not yet sinking her. Smoke and flame rose from the ship, but she stayed afloat and continued to fire. The coup de grace fell to the A-20s. 4 Bostons from the 51st MTAP, loaded with 1,000-kilogram bombs, approached at very low altitude, Mast-Height. They roared in over the water through a web of surviving flak and released their bombs with precision. 2 of the massive weapons struck home. The explosions tore through Niobe's hull and internal structure. This time, the flagship could not endure. She capsized and sank in the harbor. The victory was costly. The Soviets lost 6 P-2s, 2 A-20Gs, and 1 IL-2 in the operation. The Germans lost 70 dead and 83 wounded from Niobe's crew of 370. But Kotka's main anti-aircraft guardian was gone. Future raids on the port would face 1 fewer set of guns. Baltic Fleet A-20 units soon resumed their broader task, harrying German and Finnish shipping wherever it could be found. They sank the merchant ship Hokusai. In a single torpedo strike, they destroyed the Finnish mine layers Vipula and Mercurius as they sat alongside each other at a dock. Altogether, VMF KBF A-20s were credited with sinking or damaging 21 German minesweepers, barges, and patrol ships in the Baltic campaign. On September 15, 1944, Finland signed an armistice. The war for the Baltic did not end. German forces still held much of the coast and many ports. Soviet A-20 MTAP units simply shifted targets, focusing entirely on German shipping. On September 18, 1944, the 51st MTAP sank the German torpedo boat T-18, a vessel comparable in size and armament to an Allied destroyer. 4 days later, on September 22nd, an A-20 torpedo from the same regiment struck the merchant ship Moero off Riga, Latvia. Moero was packed with German soldiers. About 655 of them died when she went down. That same day, A-20s damaged the merchant ships Sumatra and Malaga. Over the course of September, the 51st MTAP claimed a dozen ships sunk or damaged. In October, as German lines retreated further west, and Operation Hannibal, the massive sea evacuation of German civilians and wounded soldiers from Baltic ports, began. To take shape, A-20 torpedo bombers were credited with sinking 19 merchant or small warships in the Baltic. Poor weather in November and December limited the number of sorties, but the work did not stop. From October 1944 to January 1945, A-20 regiments dropped several hundred mines into and around Baltic ports in Latvia and Estonia, adding another layer of danger to increasingly frantic German evacuation efforts. One dramatic action took place on October 31, 1944. 5 Soviet A-20Gs attacked the SS Bremerhaven. Their aerial torpedoes and bombs found the mark. 1 torpedo and 2 bomb hits sank the ship. Around 410 passengers and crew died in the attack. In December, large air raids were mounted on the port of Liepāja on the 14th and 22nd. A-20s sank 5 merchant ships in those 2 attacks. By January 1945, the situation for Germany in the east was collapsing. The Kriegsmarine began Operation Hannibal, one of the largest sea evacuations in history, using merchant ships and warships to remove refugees and wounded soldiers from East Prussian and Baltic ports to safer harbors in Germany and Denmark. Soviet submarines, torpedo boats, and naval aviation all attacked these convoys whenever they could reach them. Among those attackers were the A-20 units of 1st GMTAP and 51st MTAP. On January 14, 1945, the SS Mimi Horn was sunk by an aerial torpedo from a 51st MTAP A-20. On the same day, the SS Emstrom was sunk by the torpedo of a 1st GMTAP aircraft. In the months that followed, the two regiments attacked dozens of ships, sinking or damaging many, as the Germans tried to pull as many people as possible out of the tightening noose. Not all targets were purely military. Civilian casualties mounted as ships carrying refugees were struck. Even as Berlin itself came under artillery fire and Soviet tanks closed in on the Reich Chancellery, A-20 crews in the Baltic continued flying sorties. On May 4, 1945, just days before Germany's surrender, Bostons of the 51st MTAP attacked the German merchant ship SS Orion, a former merchant raider and auxiliary cruiser now carrying civilians. She was sunk with the loss of about 150 passengers. That same day, the training battleship KMS Schlesien, attempting to evade an air-launched torpedo from an A-20, struck a British mine. To avoid sinking outright, she was deliberately run aground. The war had only hours left, but the job for Baltic Fleet Aviation was not yet finished. On May 5th, a mixed strike of A-20s armed with 1,000-kilogram bombs and IL-2s attacked the stranded Schlesien. Bombs and rockets turned the once mighty pre-dreadnought into a total loss. It was a grim bookend, a ship from the era of coal and ironclads, crippled by a mine while dodging a medium torpedo bomber designed in California and modified in Soviet yards. Taken together, the combat record of Soviet A-20 regiments across the Black Sea, Arctic, Baltic, and Pacific was formidable. Naval archives and post-war tallies confirmed that A-20s took part in over 200 attacks against major Axis warships and merchant ships. Using torpedoes, bombs, and air-delivered mines, they were credited with sinking more than 40 ships and damaging at least 15 others. The total tonnage of shipping sunk or damaged exceeded 100,000 tons. Behind each of those numbers were thousands of Axis sailors and soldiers killed, wounded, or captured. Yet the A-20's contributions went beyond tonnage. Their strikes disrupted evacuations, delayed troop movements, forced convoys into more dangerous routes, and compelled Axis naval commanders to divert scarce resources to escort and anti-aircraft defense. A raid that sank a minesweeper today might allow a Soviet submarine through a gap tomorrow. Mines dropped from an A-20 in October could ruin an evacuation convoy in January. A torpedo that missed its target might still force a ship to turn at the wrong moment and hit a mine instead. This cumulative, indirect effect was harder to quantify, but it was real. The crews who flew these missions operated under conditions that would strain any airman. In the Black Sea, they faced intense anti-aircraft fire from well-escorted convoys and fighter opposition from the Luftwaffe and Romanian Air Force. In the Arctic, they contended with freezing temperatures, storms, low cloud, and the strange alternating extremes of polar day and night. In the Baltic, they flew into some of the densest air defenses Germany could muster, against harbors bristling with flak ships, coastal guns, and searchlights. Their tactics evolved with experience. Mast-Height bombing, for example, demanded precise timing and courage. An A-20 on such an attack would thunder towards its target at perhaps 15 meters above the sea, bouncing in the ground effect of its own wings. The navigator in the nose counted down seconds and distance, calling for release at exactly the right moment. The pilot had to ignore the instinct to climb away from looming masts and stay low to maximize lethality and minimize exposure time. Bombs left the racks, skipped, and either struck the hull or detonated nearby, sending shock waves through steel plates and compartments. Torpedo attacks were equally unforgiving. The A-20, flying low, had to release its single weapon within the constrained envelope of speed and altitude required for a torpedo to enter the water correctly. Too high, and the torpedo could break up. Too fast, and it might dive too deep or tumble. Too close, and the aircraft risked flying straight into the blast or a wall of shellfire from the target and escorts. Navigators and pilots learned to judge the lead angle against moving ships, compensate for wind and waves, and choose the best approach direction to present the smallest silhouette to enemy gunners. Mine-laying operations brought their own discipline. At night, without visual references, A-20 crews relied on dead reckoning from known points or on radio beacons. The navigator, often the most overworked man aboard, tracked time, speed, and heading constantly. At the calculated release point, the pilot eased the bomber into exactly the right position, and the mine dropped away, falling into a black sea. The crew saw nothing more. The mine would either lie dormant or be detected and swept, or it would wait until a ship's hull triggered it, sometimes months later. Throughout all of this, the A-20 airframe proved rugged and forgiving. Its twin engines offered a margin of safety. Many crews returned home on one engine, the other feathered. Its tricycle landing gear handled rough fields better than many tail-draggers. Its cockpit layout was rational enough that Soviet crews adapted quickly. The main differences lay in instrumentation and radio equipment, which ground crews adjusted to Soviet standards where possible. The very fact that the aircraft was foreign, however, meant that Soviet maintenance units had to improvise. Spare parts came by convoy. When they did not arrive, mechanics salvaged from damaged or crashed A-20s or fabricated pieces locally. The reliability of American engines and systems made a difference here. In a theater where Soviet-built aircraft often suffered from limited service lives early in the war, the A-20s held up well. Recognition came, slowly and often quietly. Several A-20 regiments in Soviet naval aviation were awarded guard status, a mark of elite performance. At least 6 A-20 pilots and navigators from naval units were named Heroes of the Soviet Union, the country's highest honor, for their roles in torpedo and bombing attacks. Their names often remained obscure outside specialist circles, overshadowed by tank commanders and fighter aces. Yet within the tight world of naval aviators, the reputation of the A-20 as a torpedo bomber and anti-shipping aircraft was solid. The Pacific, for its part, saw fewer dramatic A-20 operations compared to the European theaters. By the time Soviet forces declared war on Japan in August 1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy had already been shattered by years of U.S. carrier operations and submarine warfare. Still, Pacific Fleet A-20 units flew maritime missions against Japanese shipping, adding their weight to a campaign whose outcome was already clear. It was in the Black Sea, Arctic, and Baltic that the A-20's impact on Axis shipping was most pronounced. Looking back across the entire war, there is a certain irony in the A-20's story over Soviet waters. Moscow had wanted heavy 4-engine bombers, strategic weapons to pound German cities and industry. Washington and London sent medium attack bombers instead, a type more suited to tactical and operational level strikes. In the end, it was precisely this combination of speed, size, versatility, and ruggedness that made the A-20 so valuable to the Soviets in their coastal and maritime war. The aircraft that Ed Heinemann and Jack Northrop had shaped from a design competition in the interwar, U.S. Army Air Corps became, in other hands, a specialist in sinking ships. Soviet modifications, glazed noses for navigators, external racks for heavy Soviet bombs, fittings for torpedoes and mines, turned it from a generalist into a focused tool of naval air warfare. From the Alba Lulia limping into Constanta with hundreds of dead aboard, to the Osag settling in the Black Sea, from convoys off northern Norway torn by Mast-Height bombers and torpedoes, to the Niobe rolling over at Kotka, from mine layers and sweepers in the Gulf of Finland to the refugee ships of Operation Hannibal. The A-20 Hull Boston left a trail of wrecks and broken hulls behind it. It never had the glamour of 4-engine behemoths or the fame of single-seat fighters. It was not central to Soviet propaganda in the way that the IL-2 Sturmovik or Yak fighters were, but in the ledger of ships lost and convoys disrupted, the Douglas A-20 in Soviet naval hands earned a quiet, lethal distinction. When the war finally ended, many surviving A-20s in Soviet service were worn out from years of hard flying, patched and repatched, their structures corroded by salt air and rough landings on improvised fields. Others lay at the bottom of seas and bays, along with their crews and their targets. The Cold War that followed would bury the details of Lend-Lease collaboration under layers of suspicion and ideology. The tale of American-built aircraft sinking German ships for Soviet naval aviation did not fit easily into the new narrative. Yet the facts remained in logbooks and after-action reports. They recorded regimental designations like 36th MTAP, 13th GDBAP, 9th MTAP, 51st MTAP, 1st GMTAP. They listed ships with unfamiliar names: Osag, Alba Lulia, Ingeborg, Niobe, Hoaxie, Moro, Mimi Horn, Orion. They marked dates, headings, bomb loads, and torpedo tracks, taken together. They told a clear story, that the Douglas A-20 Havoc, the Boston, became one of the most effective anti-shipping weapons in Soviet service. Long after the last of the Bostons had been scrapped or sunk, that story still runs just beneath the surface of the wider war narrative, like a mine resting on a silted seabed, out of sight but not inert. For those who look closely, it reminds us that wars at sea are decided not only by battleships and carriers, but also by smaller, faster machines flown at mast height into walls of fire by crews whose names most people will never know.